I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close Up. We'll hear an insider's view of President Trump's divisive four-year term later on. But first, Mayor Eric Adams is experiencing pressure on a number of fronts. First, there's the surge of migrants that have overwhelmed city shelters, leading him to suggest placing these people temporarily on cruise ships. There's also the specter of a large budget deficit to the tune of $10 billion that the mayor has to manage. And one of his closest advisors, Frank Carone, has announced he will resign by year's end. Adams has also recently made decisions on private sector vaccine mandates, on preschool programs, and there's the ongoing look into his law and order platform. Joining us now, New York Times Metro reporters Dana Rubinstein and Jeff Mays. They've both been covering the mayor. Welcome to both of you. Dana, I had dinner the other night with two veterans of city government. One of them said Eric Adams has no idea about governing. The other one said he's only been in office 9 months, given what he inherited from a mayor who was almost totally self-indulgent, given the homeless crisis, given inflation, given the fact that crime is going up all around the country. He hasn't done a bad job. Which is it? That's an easy one, a softball question.
Look, it has been 9 months. That's both a short period of time and nearly 1/4 of his term. So, time is of the essence. You do have to deal with the things before your term runs out. He was dealt a very difficult hand by virtue of the pandemic and the economy and things that his predecessor created for him. But there is also a sense that people are very eager to see an agenda from him that goes beyond just crime fighting, which, while very important, is just one part of a much larger and more complicated city.
And Jeffrey, in crime fighting, which is really, we've seen in past years, in the 70s, 80s, certainly with Rudy Giuliani in the 90s, how important crime fighting is to the overall view of the city in terms of the economy in particular. Is he making an impact on that? And in fact, are those things simply too big for any mayor to handle? Is that a national problem? Is it an economic problem? What is the mayor doing about that, and what can he do?
Well, I think, first of all, homicides and shootings have declined slightly. So there are some victories to be had there. However, violent crime, some of the robberies, rapes, those things are up by somewhat 40% in some cases. Part of the problem is the way the mayor speaks about this, right? He talks about crime a lot. And in some ways, some people think it might be damaging to his own efforts to sort of deal with crime. And certainly, we know that crime is not just a standalone issue. It's related to other things such as the economy, whether people have jobs, housing, mental health, all of these other complex issues. So I think the call has been for the mayor to maybe stop focusing so much on crime and also start looking at the sort of broader picture, the issues that sort of feed into the causes of crime.
Is there anything more he can do or the police commissioner can do about crime? One of the things that was certainly debated in the Bloomberg administration and under Mayor de Blasio was stop and frisk. The question was, could you disprove a negative when you stop and frisk people and they're not carrying guns? Does that mean they were scared away or that stop and frisk was irrelevant? Is the mayor or the police department stopping and frisking more people, and is that having any more effect at this point?
Well, I think if you look at the recent mayor's management report, it shows that quality of life offenses have gone up tremendously since he's been mayor. After a 12-year decline, we're seeing a 12,000 increase in the number of quality of life ticketing that's going up. So that means police are out on the street, they're interacting with people over issues such as spitting on the sidewalk or putting their feet up on the subway train. These are some of the issues under Mayor Bloomberg that people believe caused problems and led to the discrimination. Of course, who's targeted in those sort of offenses is an issue. But the mayor has made no secret that he thinks quality of life issues need to be enforced and strongly enforced. Things like fare evading. He said many times that you can't have people evading fares because they might have guns. Now, the connection is not always there. But every time the police catch someone hopping the turnstile with a gun, you hear about it. So part of it, too, is the way he's discussing crime. And I think that's partially what's leading to some of the big concerns from the public.
And presumably the same thing about what has been loosely referred to as bail reform. He wants tighter regulations and says that the reforms that were put in place have made more criminals, left more criminals out on the street.
Although there's no evidence of that, and in fact, there's the report that recently came out that showed that there has been no change due to bail reform, but the mayor is insistent upon that. He's made that a big issue in Albany. In fact, irritating some legislators there about this constant refrain that bail reform is the cause of the sort of uptick in crime we're seeing when there is no clear evidence that that's the case.
And he's also causing some irritation to the governor's office, who is running for re-election. So even as he is sort of saying that he has closed all of the rivers leading to gun violence that he can control, the state has not, he's sort of punting it to the governor, who is running against a Republican who is arguing that she's not doing enough to tamp down on crime.
Well, that's a fascinating story that you've written, that the Republican candidate for governor, Lee Zeldin, has sort of weaponized the mayor as a tool against Kathy Hochul, the Democrat. How effective has that been?
For Zeldin,
Yep.
you know, I mean, there was a poll out yesterday showing he's some 17 points behind Hochul. He's running as a far-right conservative who is Trump-aligned in New York State, and I'm not sure that that's such an effective strategy.
It may take more than that.
I mean, I think nationally you're seeing Republicans focus on crime as the issue that they think is going to drive people to the polls, and it's certainly no different here. You know, the mayor has made clear that he does not agree with Zeldin on certain issues, but certainly their rhetoric has been very similar on things such as bail reform, and that is not helpful to the governor as she seeks re-election.
Dana's $10 billion deficit. How big a deal is that? I mean, the budget is a lot more than $10 billion. So when the mayor says we're going to have to make cuts this year of some 3%, next year 4%, how much is that going to eat into services? He says no layoffs, but isn't that going to affect how the city supports services to people on an everyday basis?
Right. He says it won't. Everyone else says it invariably will. Everyone else being budget experts. So I think it's safe to assume that it will ultimately impact services. You can already see we're suffering all sorts of service deficits already. You know, you look at the numbers, we're not installing bike lanes, bus lanes, we're not pushing through affordable housing deals as quickly as, we're not meeting any of the city's own goals in that regard. So we're not placing people in permanent housing as quickly as we want to. So it's really hard to imagine that services won't be affected, especially since so many departments are already suffering from really severe staffing issues, all sorts of attrition, all sorts of people leaving city service for various reasons, among them the demand that people return to the office 5 days a week without any exemptions.
I mean, if you make an argument that these cuts won't affect services, then why were we spending this money in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, his messaging has been somewhat erratic on this. He did just in June sign a record-breaking $101 billion budget. So what is that money for? Yes, I mean, it's a totally fair question.
And we've gone through a fiscal crisis, a major one in the 1970s. Now we're talking about a $10 billion hole. Are these apples and oranges? Are we talking about something of that magnitude, or is this something totally different?
I mean, it's impossible to say, but one thing that people do point out is that in the 70s, the city was rescued by the state. Now the state is facing similar economic headwinds, as is the federal government. So if things do go in sort of the worst possible trajectory, who would rescue us?
And that was a systemic crisis, was it not? That was years and years of borrowing that built up. This is inflation. This is other things that are causing a more immediate crisis. Is that correct?
Yeah, and there's a long-term crisis ahead of us. For example, real estate taxes are a huge portion of the city's budget. As we know, hybrid work, part-time work is in effect now. And so how will that affect the value of these buildings? And that determines how much real estate taxes they pay. If there's a long-term reduction in the amount of real estate taxes that the city has, they may have to readjust their budget outlook going forward long-term.
And that can obviously affect things in the out years and make the budget deficit even worse. What about migrants? A great, arguably, political ploy by the Republicans, at least in the short term, sending migrants to New York and other so-called sanctuary cities. How is this city going to deal with that if it continues and just doesn't peter away as a political stunt?
It's a tough
You
issue.
can build only so many tents.
It's a tough issue. The White House is not stepping in and helping. The city is stretched thin due to budgetary and staffing constraints. So, they're setting up tent operations in Orchard Beach in the Bronx and some other still to be determined location. Talking about putting people on cruise ships. I mean, the city, it's a tough predicament for the mayor. It's not an easy problem.
Yeah, I think part of the problem is that the city has this influx coming in at a time where we're already dealing with homelessness here and other serious issues. Part of the problem is that the mayor is getting pressure from all sides. We're having people come here, but at the same time, he's getting pressure from advocates. The mayor has sort of hinted that the right to shelter law, which requires the city to house anyone who asks for it, that those might be different when it comes to dealing with the migrants. And there is already strong pushback on any changes to that law. So the mayor has a huge issue ahead of him, 11,000 migrants. But at the same time, we had existing issues with housing, getting people out. There's a staffing issue with people who speak Spanish, for example, getting landlords to accept vouchers and even building affordable housing for people.
So I guess in answer to my first question, it's too early to tell.
Yes.
Thanks to Jeff Mays, Dana Rubinstein for joining us. And coming up next, Peter Baker on 4 years of President Trump. Welcome back. Donald Trump's time as president was characterized by one thing, perhaps more than any other: chaos. It's challenging to remember all the details of the roller coaster ride that was the Trump administration, but through it all, the New York Times was on the ground reporting on all of it from the eye of the storm. Peter Baker was the Times White House correspondent for the entire 4 years, one of the key reporters on all of the story. He's now co-authored a book, The Divider: Trump in the White House, 2017 to 2021, with Susan Glasser, to whom he's married. Peter joins us on Zoom, and welcome and thank you for joining us, Peter. Congratulations on the book. Great reviews in, among other places, The Times, The Guardian, NPR. Let me ask you, you covered the White House for 4 years. What more did you learn about Trump in the research on the book after he left office?
Well, Sam, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it. We decided to do this book because we figured there was so much still untold, right? We spent 4 years trying to unearth every possible story we could while Trump was in office, but there was still so much more to be learned. And we did 300 interviews after Trump left office, including a couple with him down in Mar-a-Lago. And one of the things we discovered was how many stories we had never heard before and how many stories that we thought we knew that we learned more about, right? That there's so much more out there. Now, this is just true of every White House I've covered. There, after the White House is over, people tend to be more willing to talk. But it seems especially true of this one, because I think that even his own people who work for him, found that what he had done needed to be told for the record, for the history. But it's no longer just history. It could also be prologue, because, of course, he's thinking about running again. So this is why we think this book is so important. The first one to capture all 4 years of his administration.
One of the things you point out in the book is that some of the officials in the administration were near constant turmoil in Trump-inflicted conflicts. Why didn't more of them quit?
Yeah, it's a great question. This is a through line through all of our interviews, or many of our interviews anyway. A lot of the people who were working for him, not the true believers who really believed in him, but the ones who thought they were there to serve the country or serve, a president that they hoped to make, a better president, found themselves constantly with this moral conundrum in their view. How long did they stay before they decided they couldn't take it anymore? And a lot of them, decided that if they left, that things would be worse if they did. That they were there to keep things from getting too far out of control, to keep the guardrails in place, and the person who might replace them would be more compliant with the president. So they talked themselves into this idea that they were indispensable to some extent. Some of that self-rationalization, right, for a choice that they might have wanted to make anyway. They were ambitious. They wanted a fancy title and a good job. But I think in some cases it was clearly true that you can see specific instances where a replacement for somebody who got fired or quit ended up doing a lot of the things that the person they took over from tried to resist. And it made a difference when there were certain people there in office.
For all the flaws, and we certainly know a lot of them, and you point out a lot more in the book, The Divider, weren't there some things that Trump did well or did right? The Abraham Accords, developing a vaccine, certainly some steps early on in the economy.
Yeah, certainly there were positive things, of course, that came out of his presidency. You just named a few of them there. The Abraham Accords, bringing Israel into the light, in effect, in the Arab world, helping it establish diplomatic relations with some of its neighbors. Super important, obviously an important breakthrough. The economy did do well on his watch. How much credit he gets for it or not, we can debate, but obviously until the COVID pandemic, that was important. But we also discovered that a lot of the things that are his achievements, or that he would claim as achievements, he had very little to do with. For instance, the tax cuts. That was one of the biggest things he did as president, maybe his number one domestic achievement. But it turns out he had almost nothing to do with it. We interviewed his own top tax policy expert, who says Donald Trump had nothing to do with this legislation. It was all fashioned on the Hill. He basically was only interested in the branding of it. He wanted to make sure it had a fancy, fun name. He wanted to call it the Cut, Cut, Tut Act, so that people would get the idea that this is about tax cuts. But beyond that, he had very little to do with it. And so, he wasn't a policy guy. It wasn't really his priority. And so I think that's one of the things we saw throughout these 4 years, that the things he was involved with, that he was most passionate about, were not the specific policy achievements that would come out of his administration.
You wrote that one of the things that January 6th proved was that what happened that day was the culmination of a 4-year war on the traditions of American democracy. What was the end game of that 4-year war?
Well, I mean, the end game was to hold on to power, right? The very specific goal he had after that election was to overturn an election that he was told by his own people that he lost. He was told by his own people that there was no fraud, sufficient to overturn the election, and that he simply didn't win. And yet he refused to accept it. And so basically the end game was very simple. It's the end game we've seen throughout history around the world. We just haven't seen it in the United States before, where a sitting American president refused to accept a defeat and tried to use the levers of power to hold on to power, in violation of the Constitution. This is a unique moment. And we think it's important to look back not just at that one event, but all of the 4 years leading up to it. That's what this book is about. It's the only one that ever has tried to capture the full 4-year story of his presidency, because to understand January 6th, 2021, you really need to understand January 20th, 2017, and every day in between.
And you say that he emerged from a 7 million vote defeat, 2 impeachments, and what happened on January 6th, and he still remains the dominant force in the Republican Party. How did that happen?
Yeah, it's a remarkable story, obviously. Despite all of this, any normal politician, of course, would be done. He's not, and he retains the support of the base of the Republican Party. He has told them for 4 years, don't listen to anybody else, just listen to me. Don't listen to the media. They're all fake news. Don't listen to Democrats. Don't listen to even fellow Republicans if they tell you something contrary to what I tell you. And so he's been very persuasive with his own base and telling them the story about a stolen election that's not true. And as long as he has the power of that base, the office holders, the Republican office holders who may not like him, in fact, most of them I don't think do, are going to go along because they see their own careers in jeopardy if they don't. Think about the 10 House Republicans who voted to impeach him the second time after January 6th. They're going to be gone. They were either defeated in primaries or forced to resign or decided to retire out of disenchantment. That's the lesson that the rest of the Republican office holders took from it.
And you write in the book he might very well regain the office he lost. What are the chances, do you think, and what would stop him?
Well, I think the chances are realistic. He's obviously at this point the heads-on favorite for the nomination should he choose to run again. Whether he would win in a general election is a little more uncertain. Remember, he didn't win the popular vote either of the two elections that he ran. He's never won the popular vote. He's the only president, in fact, in the history of polling who never had the support of more than 50% of the population for even a single day of his presidency. So in many ways, he has a very weak hand, but he plays it strong. And it's always possible that he can translate that into, once again, some sort of a electoral college win, even if he couldn't win the popular vote. So I think it's a very real possibility that he comes back.
How much was the press, the media, responsible for his ascent by making him the focal point of 2016? And if that was so, what should we be doing differently in the next election?
Well, there's a lot of criticism, of course, of television for giving him sort of a platform, for letting him have these rallies unedited at great length. There was even, of course, a famous moment where they simply, one of the cable shows showed an empty podium for quite a long time, just simply waiting for him to show up as if it was, a rock star or something. There's an argument to be made about that. But the truth is, a lot of the journalism in 2016 was quite remarkable. I think it foreshadowed a lot of the issues we would see in his presidency. If you go back and read it, it talked about his penchant for false statements and lies. It talked about his history in business of making things up and shading reality. It talked about his bankruptcies. It talked about his habits of forcing racial division in the history of New York. He, of course, was always on the side of the provocateur. So a lot of these things that became issues later on, I think, were foreshadowed during the coverage in 2016, but it didn't impress a lot of Americans who decided they wanted a change, and he was the ultimate version of change in their book.
Why did he agree to talk with you and Susan after he left office? Was that sheer hubris?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't think he obviously thought this book was going to be favorable or, some sort of a sycophantic book or something like that. But he has this confidence in himself that if he simply sits down with reporters in particular, he can charm them, he can persuade them, he can convince them of his side of the story. And of course, his reporters were always willing and always eager to talk to the subjects of our stories and our books. But it was not these were not useful interviews in the sense of establishing history, right? He's not a reliable fact witness. If you ask him what happened in this meeting or what happened in that meeting, he's going to give you a version of what happened that's probably at variance with almost everybody else in the room, because he tends to make up his own reality. So what those interviews are useful for then are mindset, trying to understand his mindset, trying to get into his head a little bit to see how he sees the world. And I think in that sense, he's a very transparent person. He tells you his motivations for things in a way that no other politician would. No other politician would admit the kinds of things that he admits very straightforwardly.
A quick last question. No epigraph in the beginning of the book. How come? Does the rest of it just speak for itself?
There's so many to pick from, but I think if there was one epigraph, it would be that it was a close run thing. That was the phrase that both General Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and John Kelly, his second White House Chief of Staff, used at different points in his presidency. It was a close run thing. That's a quote from Wellington after his very narrow defeat of Napoleon at Waterloo. And the point is that basically, yeah, people say the institutions held, that in the end it was okay. But the truth is it was a close run thing, because if you simply substitute a handful of people in the right positions at the end, we would be in a very different position today. Imagine a vice president who was willing to try to assert the power to single-handedly change the election, or an attorney general who would have been willing to get up there and say, yeah, there was fraud out there, when in fact there wasn't. Any of these people, a governor here, a secretary of state there, had there been a different set of people, things could have been very different. And that's why this book is important, because the story in some ways is not over.
The book is The Divider, thanks to Peter Baker of the New York Times. And next, I'll have some thoughts on other books. We're between beach reading and the fireplace or video Yule log, but when you're finished with The Divider, a number of New York books recently published would be worth perusing right now. Michael Daley's New York Finest is a tribute to the police force we often take for granted. Daley's riveting nonfiction narrative is an ode to two cops you may have heard of but never met this intimately. One is Steve McDonald, shot in the line of duty, rendered a paraplegic, and had the grace to forgive his assailant. The other, Jack Maple, a former transit cop who came up with the commonsensical, data-driven idea of CompStat, which held the NYPD accountable for preventing crime instead of merely responding to it. Joe Calderone has written a novel based on real events, as the book says, about the 342 New York firefighters killed on 9/11. It's also about a newspaper's fight for the truth about blunders by the city administration that made a tragic day even worse. Andrew Meyer has completed his monumental biography titled Morgenthau: Power, Privilege, and the Rise of an American Dynasty. It's about 3 generations of the New York family that included the ambassador, the Treasury Secretary under FDR, and of course Bob Morgenthau, the former federal prosecutor and venerable Manhattan District Attorney. TV scriptwriter Ed Zuckerman's debut thriller, Wealth Management, is already scoring impressive reviews. The Financial Times calls it a clever, entertaining romp through the world of high finance and dirty money. The FT says Wealth Management skillfully veers around global politics, international finance, terrorist threats, and a love triangle. And if you're looking for a little uplift, grab a copy of It's All About the Girls, edited by Anne Rubinstein Tisch. The book celebrates the 25th anniversary of the Student Leadership Network's Young Women's Leadership Schools. For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.